You know, if you go back to the mid-70s, I mean, if I can take a moment to expand on this, because it's actually a story that I think is extremely important and most people don't know, even though the facts are available to anybody who wants to do a little bit of research. But in 1976, a conservative economist named Jude Wanniski wrote an article in which he articulated what he called the Two Santa Claus Theory. And this was published in a magazine, as I said, in 1976. The theory is that the Democratic Party is so successful in American politics because they are effectively Santa Claus. They give people lots of stuff that people like, and so people vote for them. The context, of course, is extremely important. This is something we lose sight of. From the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, and his presidency began in March of 1933. He came in with huge majorities, Democratic majorities, in the House and the Senate after 12 years of Republican control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. So Franklin Roosevelt comes in the early 30s, and the Democratic Party dominated both houses of Congress all the way up until the 1980s. Now, there were two brief periods in the late 40s and the mid-50s when the Republicans had majorities in the House and the Senate for 2 years each, so a total of 4 years. But aside from that, from 1933 until 1981 in the case of the Senate, and from 1933 to 1995 in the case of the House of Representatives, that's 62 years, the Democratic Party was in charge and in control. And so in the 1970s, a number of conservative thinkers began to try to plot a course back to power. And Jude Wanniski was not the first person to do this. But what he did in 1976 was write this article in which he articulated the Two Santa Claus Theory. And he said, the reason Democrats have this lock on power is because they give people things, and people reward them with their votes. They give them Social Security, they give them Medicare and Medicaid, they give them, I mean, presumably civil rights, they give them Pell Grants, they give them clean air and water. These are things that they're giving to people, the Great Society programs, et cetera. So from a Republican point of view, this is a kind of giveaway, a kind of almost like bribing the electorate in exchange for support. Of course, from a Democratic point of view, that's democracy. You know, you use tax dollars to do things that people support and that people benefit from. That's what the Democratic Party was doing, and that's why it maintained its lock on power for so long. So Wanniski theorized that that if the Republican Party came up with a way to be Santa Claus too, that would help them get back to power. And his suggestion was tax cuts. That's the thing that the Democrats were not doing for the people. And so Republicans could be the party of tax cuts, and everybody likes tax cuts. Everybody likes to keep more of their paycheck at the end of the week, and everybody would like to spend a little less money on April 15th, sending money to the IRS. So he proposed this idea, and then he more or less teamed up with Arthur Laffer, the famous Laffer curve, who articulated a seemingly credible economic theory that, you know, cutting taxes would raise revenue. What he really did was he re-articulated a theory that had been around for a very long time. I mean, I think the antecedents of this idea go all the way back to the 15th century in Europe. But basically, the idea is that tax, if you plot, you know, tax rates against revenue. So the idea is that if you have you know, the tax revenues on the y-axis and tax rates on the x-axis, you basically have a parabola. So at 0% taxation, you get zero revenue. And at 100% taxation, you also get zero revenue because the taxes are so onerous that nobody's going to be inspired to do any kind of work, and there's going to be no economic activity that the government can tax, and therefore revenue goes to zero. The question is, at what point between those two extremes do you maximize revenue? And Republicans use this question, really, as a way of suggesting that the parabola kind of lean to the left, that more or less, or from your point of view, to the left. So the idea is that by cutting taxes, you will get more revenue. But there's no indication of where exactly that optimal moment is. And in fact, most studies, most surveys, most economists that have looked into this, there's no real consensus, but the preponderance of the evidence says that it should be around 70%. So it's really quite high.
Which is
where
it was when we had a great economy. We'll continue this right after the break. More of tonight's Conversations of Great Minds with J.P. Birnbach right after this break. And JP, we were just talking about Jude Wanniski and his Two Santa Claus Theory. That theory, I've written at some length about this also. That theory played out exactly as you described, but then modern Republicans added a second piece to it, which is, okay, now that we've established ourselves as the tax cut Santa Claus, we have to get the Democrats to shoot their Santa Claus, specifically Social Security. And President Obama nearly did with the chain CPI. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the fact is that's very true. I mean, there's the famous line about shrinking government to the size of drowning it into the bathtub. That was I guess Grover Norquist. But the idea was, I think, from one of the hidden benefits of the tax cuts thing for Republicans was that it caused enormous debt and deficits, and that was something which I think had a benefit for them over the long term, because it allowed them to create this boogeyman that they could use as a pretext for cutting the social programs that they had been opposed to from the very beginning, the New Deal programs and the Great Society programs. When Dick Cheney famously said that Reagan proved that deficits don't matter, I don't think he was describing an economic idea. I think he was describing a political phenomenon, which is that there was no political downside to the fact that Republicans created enormous debt and deficits. This is one of the things that I mentioned in my book, that it's surprising to me that people don't really ever look at. But the national debt of the United States from 1950 to 1980 was constant. It was constant, okay? It fluctuated a little bit, but basically along a horizontal line. And as a percentage of GDP, it declined precipitously from about 90%, from above 90% to about 32% when Reagan took office. By the time he left office, the national debt had doubled in real terms. It had tripled in nominal terms, but when you adjust for inflation, he doubled it, and it had gone up to 50% of GDP. So it's with Reagan that we get this enormous national debt and these large deficits, which have been a thing that Republicans, who are the source and the cause of the debts, make into a boogeyman. It's kind of ironic. So they are the creators of the debt. They are the fiscally irresponsible party, but they talk about it all the time, and they scare the public about the debt and the deficit, and they use that as a pretext to alarm people into supporting cuts to social benefit programs, which they would never support otherwise. If people are afraid that Social Security is going to vanish, then maybe they'll support some sort of radical change or privatization of Social Security. But if people are aware of the fact that Social Security is fine, then they're not going to tolerate those cuts. So when you create these boogeymen, and the debt is one of those boogeymen, which is literally and figuratively created by Republican economic or fiscal policies, then you can start to slash and burn and get rid of the programs that Democrats instituted that Republicans have disliked from the very beginning, including Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and so on.